My name is Eleanor Margaret Hayes. I am 42 years old. I live in a small two-story clapboard house on a tree-lined street in Columbus, Ohio. For the past 8 years I've been married to Jonah. Quieter than me, methodical, the kind of man neighbors describe as steady. Lately I've been anything but steady. 2 weeks ago I had surgery. A long, nasty infection that refused to leave until they took a chunk of tissue out and rewired my antibiotics. I spent 5 nights in a hospital smelling constantly of disinfectant and oversweet hospital coffee, counting the fluorescent lights on my ceiling like a bad habit. I was discharged a day earlier than expected. The doctor said I was stable and that my body had cooperated. Emotionally, I felt raw in the way you feel after someone has opened a seam and stitched you back together. Grateful for the work done and terrified that it wouldn't hold. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The day the wheels of my car hit our driveway, I remember thinking of the small comforts I'd missed. The old blanket that lived in the back of my favorite chair, the way Jonah made his black coffee with too much sugar and left the mug rings on the kitchen counter like tiny moons. The air that evening had that late fall bite to it, the kind that makes you pull your cardigan tighter and notice how the world smells like damp leaves and wood smoke. I unlocked the front door and the house smelled familiar in the way that a photo smells like the person who held it. Lemon oil from the wood floors, a faint scent of laundry detergent from the bedroom, a dry, stale sweetness from the pitcher of wine we'd left on the table 2 nights before. He wasn't in the kitchen. He wasn't in the bedroom. The living room was empty. There were no shoes by the door, no coat hanging on the peg. The suitcase, the medium-sized duffel he'd kept at the foot of our closet for years, was gone. At first I thought maybe he'd taken it to the car, maybe he'd gone for a walk while I was at the hospital. Then my throat tightened and something in my chest went cold and heavy. I called his name. Jonah. My voice sounded like the rustle of paper. The house gave me back only its own echoes. I walked through each room with the slow, careful movements of someone who is bracing for bad news. The dresser drawers were half open as if someone had been interrupted. His toothbrush was in the cup beside mine. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no note on the kitchen table. Just the suitcase missing and that gap like a reflection with something washed out of it. I remember sitting down at the kitchen table and gripping the edge until my knuckles blanched. My hands trembled. My pulse felt like it was trying to run away from me. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between my fingers and the wood. I replayed the last few days in my head, the nights in the hospital, the way he'd hovered in the doorway, distracted. He had been there the first night, sitting in a plastic chair with dark circles under his eyes, but by the 3rd day he'd been different. Shorter answers, more distracted looks at his phone, a tight stiffness around his jaw that I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. I dialed his number and listened to the recorded voice tell me it went to voicemail. I left a message that was more a scaffolding than protest. Hey, it's Elle. They let me out. I'm home. Call me. My voice broke on the last word. I waited on the porch for 10 minutes with the house like an animal holding its breath. The street lamp blinked on and a neighbor's television through thin curtains muttered the evening news. Somewhere a car drove by, tires humming on wet asphalt. Nothing. Then I noticed the small things. A receipt from a diner tucked under a magazine, the newspaper folded wrong on the front stoop. His green thermos in the sink with a coffee ring stained at the rim. I found his wallet on the entry table, keys in the bowl, phone on the coffee table. The suitcase was the only thing missing. I thought absurdly maybe he'd just run out to the store. Maybe he'd had to go pick up his sister. Maybe. But when you've shared a bed for years, you learn the outlines of panic. This was a new, sharp one. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I needed help, but I didn't know who to call first. I texted my sister Hannah and my friend Marco. Home. Suitcase missing. Phone off. I typed with thumbs that felt foreign. Marco called nearly immediately. Eleanor. Are you okay? He asked, voice slanted with worry. I could hear the clink of something in his background. A mug against a saucer. He's the kind of friend who keeps lists in his head and offers them as lifelines. No, I said. It was the most honest thing I could manage. He's gone, I think. Gone how? The word came out crisp and practical. Left town. Gone, I said again, and this time it was a hollow sound. His bag's gone. No note. Phone to voicemail. He was distant at the hospital. I stopped because saying the word distant felt like accusing Payne of taking a vacation. I'll be over, Marco said. Don't go anywhere. He arrived with a gallon of orange juice and 3 stale donuts, and sat across from me in our kitchen like someone who had been called into a small war and didn't know the weapons. He listened as I said things out loud that my hands had only been thinking. Our arguments about money we never had, the nights he came home smelling like smoke when he used to say he'd been at work, the way he turned away when I tried to make plans for us. He didn't say the word affair or left. He put his hand over mine once, and it was like wet paper trying to be strong. I spent the night awake, the house sounding like it had been emptied of a person but not of a story. Every creak, every settling noise was a punctuation. I slept in fits, waking to the memory of surgeons in pale green, to my own breath that tasted of iron. I stared at the empty space on the closet floor where his suitcase usually sat and catalogued every possibility like someone listing bridges to cross. The suitcase missing was a sign not just of departure, but of a threshold crossed. I didn't know yet whether it would lead to answer or to chasm. The morning after, a cold, honest light crept into the kitchen. I made coffee because making the small routine things felt like building scaffolding around my nerves. The coffee smelled too strong. The filter paper crackled like dry leaves. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, afraid of headlines and their blunt betraying angles, but something in me needed information, any kind of anchor. It was Mrs. Talbot from next door. "Eleanor dear," she said, her voice the soft rasp of someone who had been awake early all her life. "I didn't want to bother you last night, but I saw Jonah leave your porch this morning. He had a bag." My knees went soft. "What time?" "Near dawn. Thought you knew." He seemed in a hurry. "Did he look angry? Did he say anything?" No, she said. "He only waved. He didn't look at anyone in particular." Her silence was an insufficient mattress for my need. "Do you need anything? I can make a casserole." I called my brother Tom. He lives in Cincinnati 2 hours away, the one who calls to make sure I've put the smoke detectors on the right batteries. He answered on the second ring. "Ellie, what's happening?" I told him the half story, the version that fit under my tongue. He was quiet in a way that made my chest ache. "I'll be there in a few hours," he said. "Lock the doors. Don't let him back in if he tries." I have always been the kind of woman who arranges small catastrophes into neat patterns. Doctor's appointments, utility bills, the shape of soup in a pot. The reality of Jonah's suitcase being gone refused to fit any pattern. I made a list because lists are how I process shock. Call the hospital, they put me on hold then transferred me. Call his workplace, voicemail. Check email, no hints. Check accounts online, my hands trembled as I typed. There were withdrawals in recent weeks. ATM machines in strip malls I didn't recognize, smaller than I'd expected but steady. There were other things I had noticed, quietly. Like dust settling on the frame of a photograph of us on our porch 3 summers ago, the way his laughter had thinned. He'd come to the hospital every other night, then started missing more days. He had cried once in the corridor outside my room and refused to tell me why. He said he didn't want to burden me. Not telling me had become his way of not burdening himself. Marco showed up with strong coffee and a face that had been made of worry overnight. "Did you see the note?" he asked. "What note?" "There was a note on the back of your car. I thought you'd left it." I walked to the driveway where dew had made tiny temporary constellations on new grass. There, beneath the windshield wiper, was a scrap of paper with my name on it in Jonah's slanted handwriting. A single line, "I'm sorry. Call." That was not a goodbye. It was not a promise. It was a thread. If you're listening and you've ever been left with a scrap of paper, a half sentence, a voicemail that answers none of your questions, hit like. Helps. I spent that day poking at the seams of our life. I opened drawers he'd kept shut. I found letters in a shoebox, postcards from cities where he'd been on business, a photograph of a young man at a baseball field with someone else's arm slung around him. I found a small tin with a key and a note in his handwriting that said, "For when I can't find home in us." My stomach dropped into my shoes like a stone. I called his employer again and finally reached a human voice. "He's been on leave," the woman said. "His file says, personal. He asked for 2 weeks off." She added, as if it might soften the edge, "We're sorry he's going through something." I drove to the clinic where he had been seeing someone for anxiety, the last piece of the puzzle I had put together from receipts and his odd late hours, and asked about him. HIPAA rules were cited like concrete, but the receptionist's eyes had the kind of sympathy that says, "I know things because I see the aftermath of them." "He was here last week," she said. "He seemed distracted. Paid cash." The more I searched, the more I found small, deliberate omissions Jonah had made. Other people's names tucked into casual conversations in ways that were precise and careful, as if he had practiced them in the mirror. A credit card statement with charges to a motel 2 towns over, a charge to a counseling service that wasn't ours, a train departure ticket with no return. Each finding was a sliver into a larger picture that was forming with the slow, stubborn cruelty of winter ice. I had not known him fully. Maybe I never had. At night, dreams came with the blunt, literal logic of nightmares. I'd be standing in our kitchen and every surface would be different. The bowl on the table empty, then full, then shattered, and Jonah would be in all the corners at once, his voice echoing from rooms I could not reach. When I woke, there was a real, physical ache under my breastbone. My hands felt foreign. I found myself checking my phone as if it were a pulse. Marco would text in the small hours. "You okay?" I would write back something that was a list of things I hadn't yet learned how to feel. That weekend, I went through his laptop because the temptation to know eclipsed my respect for privacy. I know that sounds terrible for many people, and I felt terrible while doing it. But grief, I found, can make you do things you swore you never would. There were emails from a woman named Michelle with subject lines that dissolved into more questions. "When? Are you sure?" There were also emails to a financial advisor, a man's name I didn't recognize, signing off with curt professionalism about debts and arrangements. My hands left fingerprints on the glass screen in a constellation of questions. Called Michelle. Her number was on the signature line like an invitation. She answered in a voice that was immediately, unmistakably human. Tired, embarrassed, careful. "Jonah is my brother," she said. He's looking for Sam." The word hit me like a cold wave. "Sam?" "Yes," she said. "He's been trying to find a son." The conversation tumbled out. Jonah at 22, a night that altered his life in a small Midwestern town, a relationship he never spoke of. "He told me he didn't know how to tell you," Michelle said. "He was scared." Abandonment is a shape that keeps reminding you where it first cut. I felt it in the way a breeze finds an open window. The suitcase, the note, the departures, they all recentered on the idea that Jonah had been carrying a secret that was not mine and that he had chosen to walk toward it alone. There were moments when I wanted to storm the town, to demand to be let in. There were other moments when I wanted to collapse into a chair and let the house and its thin, lemony curtains hold me. People say a marriage is built on trust. They say betrayals break that trust into pieces. But sometimes it's not one single thing that makes the fracture. It's the accumulation of small, quiet absences. Missed dinners, phones turned off, stories left halfway, until the architecture of your life fans into something that cannot support weight anymore. That is the version I was living. When I opened the suitcase compartment in our closet, the shelf where Jonah kept extra blankets and the duffel he'd taken on weekend trips, it was honestly the exact thing you imagine. An absence like a missing tooth. It felt, in a way, like a deliberate erasure. I began to catalogue everything he had left behind and everything he had taken. He'd taken his winter coat, a pair of running shoes, a battered paperback of Nabokov I'd teased him about. He had not taken his watch or his old army bracelet. He had taken, it seemed, the parts of himself that were anchored to motion. I decided to follow the paper trail. The ATM withdrawals, the motel charge, the train ticket, they led to a small railway station 2 hours south of Columbus. I drove down an empty highway under a sky that had the color of old photographs. The world passed like faded postcards, a billboard with a church's message, a gas station with a sleepy clerk. The town the train stopped in had a main street that still remembered horses, with a diner where the coffee was black and strong and the waitress had a tattoo of praying hands on her wrist. The motel was a fluorescent rectangle under a motel sign with one missing bulb. The clerk at the desk remembered Jonah. He had checked in under a name I didn't recognize, but the clerk said something that made my throat tighten. He paid cash, asked us to keep his plate in the fridge, said he was waiting for a boy. I felt like I had been walking in a dream where everything was in focus, except the most important person. When I asked for a room key, the clerk hesitated, then handed it over. Room 12 smelled like a mixture of cleaning fluid and old summer. I sat on the edge of the bed with the key still in my hand and let the rooms hum and the weight of reality meet. I thought about the hospital leak where surgeons had talked quietly in gloves, about the way Jonah's hands had trembled when he told me he could handle anything. The suitcase had been the thing he took when he wanted to remake himself elsewhere. When he walked into the room, I didn't immediately recognize him. The weight of it, the way he had been diminished in the curve of his shoulders, made his face small. He smelled like smoke and something like shame. He sat on the bed across from me, not touching me. The motel room buzzed with a small, distant life I felt excluded from. "Eleanor," he said. His voice had that brittle, honest quality of someone who's been rehearsing apologies. "You left a note," I said. It was both accusation and plea. "You said you'd call." "I called," he said. "I didn't want to come home like that." He gestured at himself as if he were to blame for the air. "I don't want you to worry." "You left," I said. "You left your suitcase." He stared at the carpet with the kind of intensity that made me think of him as someone trying to read a language he'd never learned. I had to see him," he said in a rush, like a dam that had finally broken. "Sam. He's my son. I found him." The room tilted. I had imagined many possible reasons for his leaving. An affair, a gambling thing, a sudden resolve to leave me. But this, a son, felt like a wall on which the years of his silence now landed and broke. I thought of the postcards in the shoebox, the photograph, the name Michelle had given me. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Came out small. "I was scared," he said simply. "I thought if I told you that part of me existed, if I told you I had this other life, this other love at some point, you'd look at me differently. I didn't want to burden you while you were sick. And I didn't know how to be two places at once." "You don't get to pick what burdens who," I said. "We were supposed to be a team." He searched my face as if for permission to be forgiven. "I know." He told me then, like someone fessing up to a slow crime, about a relationship when he was younger, a woman named Laura, a night they were careless and a baby that wasn't his to raise but that he loved anyway. He said he'd left for work and had always meant to come back, and life had broken into its pragmatic shapes. Rent, jobs, illness, the need to have someone steady in his life. He'd found Sam years later through an ancestry website, found a name in a hospital birth log, and then found a living boy who had Jonah's eyes. Jonah described the moment he had seen Sam across a soccer field, and something in him had snapped open and bled into motion. "And you left now because?" asked voice like an edge. "Because you were in the hospital," he said. "Because I couldn't do both. I wanted to be honest, but I'd been building this other life like a small secret room, and I thought I could visit it without it changing us. I thought I could protect you from that truth. And you think leaving my house, taking a suitcase and coming back with a son you never told me about is protection?" My voice was brittle. I could feel the words cut themselves out of me. He put his head in his hands. "No," he said. "I don't. I was a coward. And then the guilt, and then something else. You were meeting him at a motel because that felt safer, I said. You were using cash, Jonah. You were trying to keep this hidden. These are details you deserve to know. He looked up at me again, and in his eyes there was a terrible pleading. Sam's mother, Laura, she's sick. He's got chemo. She didn't want him around hospitals. She asked Jonah not to tell you because she thought it would break me, or you, or both. He's fragile. The words rearranged things. The scenario didn't absolve him, but it complicated the moral chalk lines I'd been drawing. There was affection, betrayal, secrecy, and a sudden convergence of old wounds and new responsibilities. I felt my chest tighten in a way that felt both like grief and like a fist clenching the first syllable of anger. You should have trusted me, I said finally. You should have trusted me enough to be terrified with you. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry. That night we did not reconcile. We traded stories with the awkwardness of two people who had been present for each other's best and worst, but had never shared this particular map. He told me about the little boy with Jonah's eyes and the way he laughed with his whole body. I told him about my fear of being abandoned, a fear that had its own roots, in a childhood where beds were moved and promises were thin. We sat on a motel bed and were two people who had once been a unit, and who were now raw edges trying to touch without slicing. In the morning, he left again with no suitcase. He said he would return with Sam to meet me properly when the timing didn't feel like a theft. He kissed my forehead like a benediction and walked out. I watched him go and felt the house inside me being emptied one room at a time. On the car ride back to Columbus, I understood that the suitcase had been less about leaving and more about identity. He had taken the part of himself he feared would not belong in the life we built together and carried it into a separate world. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends, if you want the rest of the messy human truth. People I spoke to later would ask me whether I forgave him then. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a slow, deliberate work. That day I felt too raw for either forgiveness or judgment. I felt myself in the middle of both. When Jonah brought Sam to our house 2 weeks later, it was raining, the kind of soft, persistent rain that makes everything smell like the earth is breathing again. The porch light haloed around the wet pavement as if to say, this is a place where things arrive. Jonah's hands were empty. Sam held a plastic dinosaur like a small shield. Sam was 8 years old and had Jonas-like eyes. Curious, polite, suspicious of grown-ups as if they were a kind of poorly explained phenomenon. Eleanor, Jonah said, voice taut. This is Sam. Sam nodded like someone apologizing for existing. His small hand was warm and sticky from the ketchup on the burger he'd eaten on the way. The first minutes were an awkward choreography. Introductions, the plumbing of silence where conversation should be. I sat on the couch, my body suddenly aware of every seam, the cushion that had once known our shape, the window that framed our yard like a stage. I kept my voice low and tried to be the kind of person who could listen without attacking, because beneath the hurt was a child who had done nothing wrong. Over the next few days our house sounded different. Small feet, a laugh that startled us into smiling, and Jonah suddenly co-parenting with a seriousness that made him both new and recognizable. He took Sam to the park, returned with stories of the boy's favorite oddities, and slowly the idea of this alternate life became less like an explosive and more like a new room in a house you weren't sure how to arrange. There were practical issues. Immigration of tax returns, questions about custody, the messy bureaucracy of a life resumed. Some nights I woke with a clammy sense of being watched by strangers. Other nights a strange softening occurred, like frost melting at dawn. But life does not straighten itself from revelation overnight. Michelle, Jonah's sister, showed up one night with a casserole and an apology that tasted of regret. There were explanations about Laura's condition, about the ways a mother's self-protection can become blindness. There were also the conversations I'd been avoiding, about the debt lines I'd found, the motel receipts, the cash withdrawals. Jonah had been trying to fund trips and visits and healthcare without letting me into the ledger because he was ashamed of how little there was. One evening Jonah and I sat in the kitchen, the night thick around us, voices soft. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how you'd fit it into us, he said. You had your own fight and I thought I could fight alone. You can't keep pieces of yourself in your pockets like contraband, I said. We end up, eventually, less than we started. He looked at me like someone trying to read their own handwriting. I know that now. There was betrayal in how he had hidden things. There was also this stubborn, human, unavoidable fact. He loved a boy with his eyes. I had to reconcile both the betrayal and the reality. I was angry, yes. I felt abandoned and lied to, yes. But I also felt, strangely, a tenderness for him as I watched him try to step into fatherhood with his awkward, earnest hands. I resented that tenderness and I resented myself for resenting it. The first time Sam called me Aunt Ellie, I cried in the pantry because the sound of it felt like both blasphemy and balm. It's strange the ways language constructs intimacy. He slid into our life with small, sure questions, about where the bread was kept, about why the dragon in his books had a scar. He wanted stories and comfort, and in offering them I discovered a capacity for softness I had convinced myself was gone. One night, after Sam had gone to bed and the house had settled into the kind of hush that holds secrets like low embers, Jonah said something that stopped me. I want us to try, he said. But only if you want it too. I don't want to force something that will make you unhappy. This was the moment that required truth over the fatigue of hurt. I want honesty, I told him. Not secrets. I want a marriage where things are brought in, not carried out. He nodded. I can do that. We went to counseling together. The counselor sat with us, her hands folded like a judge, and asked the questions that had been hovering like moths. We talked about trust, about boundaries, about what it means to hold another person's secrets. I spoke about the hospital and the fluorescent lights, about waking up to find my life missing something. Jonah spoke about a younger version of himself who had been terrified and learned to hide. Sometimes sessions were progress. Sometimes they were a trench we had to crawl through, mud and all. There were naps I took where the anxiety eased, and then nights where I woke at 3 a.m. and felt the edge of panic slice my calm into 1,000 small cries. If this has struck a chord with you, has someone's secret ever changed everything? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. It helps to know we're not alone. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, tools for living found their way into our home. A new calendar started to record honesty days. Days when we promised to speak truth even if it hurt. Jonah started attending a debt counseling group. He and Sam had their own rituals. Saturday pancakes, a silly handshake they developed that made us both laugh like fools. I started seeing a therapist for my own wounds. When your marriage rearranges itself, you're allowed to be selfish for your healing. I needed to learn how to breathe without assuming abandonment at every creak. Not everything smoothed. There were still nights of anger where I would go to the guest room and stare at the empty suitcase's usual shelf and feel a stabbing. There were still moments of doubt where I wondered if I could ever fully trust him again. He had opened a door I didn't know existed. I was learning to walk through it with him instead of slamming it shut. A year later, the house felt different. Not fixed. Nothing of importance ever snaps back to the pristine arrangement it once was, but rearranged with purpose. The front hallway had a new mat that said, "Welcome," and Sam's drawings hung on the refrigerator next to a note about a college application I was filling out online for myself. A small, gleaming thing that said I was, strangely, thinking of my future. Jonah, with all his imperfect courage, had integrated this other life into our shared one in ways that were messy and beautiful. Sam had started 4th grade and picked a favorite author whose name I now knew by heart. We celebrated small victories like a decent family dinner where no one left in tears. But the suitcase, the original suitcase that had been the symbol of that first fracture, was never quite returned to its place the same way. Sometimes it sat in the closet untouched, a relic we both pretended wasn't a relic. Sometimes I would drag it out, open it, and find nothing that connected to the person who had left it behind. Objects are strange that way. They accumulate meaning beyond their shape. The suitcase had been both a departure and a catalyst. One quiet Sunday I found myself in our bedroom, old photographs spread on the bed like a small archaeology of us. There were pictures of younger versions of us on road trips, sunburnt and joyful, a wedding photo that made me choke up despite everything. I traced the lines in Jonah's face. Lines made from years of worry, laughter, and now parenthood. He came in and sat beside me on the bed. We didn't speak for a long time. We just let the silence be a fabric we were wearing and not a weapon. "I'm sorry," he said. It was a small adult thing to say again. There were many sorries in our life, each with its own currency of apology and repair. "I forgive you," I said, but I was careful. Forgiveness, for me, had to be both a word and a process. I would choose to trust him again, but I would not forget what I had learned from being left. I would guard my boundaries and my dignity with the fierceness of someone who had had her hands opened by pain and learned how to close them with intention. We learned to ask for help. Hannah became more present in our lives, offering practical things like a carpool to school and moral things like a listening ear that did not judge our slow, sometimes mindless groping toward repair. Marco would pop his head in with bad jokes and casseroles. Michelle found a way to be part of Sam's life without smothering. We had to recalibrate trust not by erasing the past but by learning how it had formed us. The counseling sessions faded into maintenance check-ins. Sometimes we would list the things we had lost and then, carefully, the things we had gained. I am not going to stand here and tell you that everything is resolved. There are nights I still wake with a tightening in my chest, the old fear of abandonment trying to reassert itself like an old habit. There are days when I still grapple with the ache of what was withheld from me for so long. But I have also learned that trauma does not have to be the final shape of your life. It can be one chapter, hard as it is, that teaches you where the seams run and how to stitch them differently. If you've heard this far, please consider subscribing if you want to follow more real stories like this. If something in this resonates, a sudden absence, a secret revealed, a tentative reconciliation, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done at my kitchen table the night Jonah left. I read every comment. Means the world. The lesson, the hard, luminous one that lives in my chest now, is not a tidy moral. It's a slow recognition. People are more complicated than the roles they occupy in our lives. Love does not excuse secrecy. Honesty does not guarantee safety. There are choices we make out of fear and choices we make out of care. And sometimes the two look frighteningly similar. I learned to name my needs and to ask for them. I learned that being vulnerable is not a weakness but a dangerous, necessary bravery. And I learned that sometimes being left with a missing suitcase is not the end of a marriage but the beginning of a different life. One where truth, however belated, can plant itself and, with patience, grow. We are still learning. I still have moments when the old panic tugs at me like a child who wants attention. But I also have days when Sam's laugh fills the kitchen and Jonah is making pancakes and I remember why I once chose him. The suitcase was the hinge. It opened us to pain and to possibility. In the end, the thing I carry with me now is not the hurt, but the knowledge that I will not be silent about my own needs again. That is my choice and it is my freedom.